If you're someone who's holding Palantir stock or thinking about investing in Palantir, then you're going to want to watch this presentation. And even if you're not, it's still quite interesting. So we've written about Palantir on numerous occasions. The last piece was in April of 2021. We wrote about an enterprise AI showdown, C3 versus Palantir. And that was the last time we looked at the company. And more recently, their stock price took a bit of a bump on the back of their 2022 earnings call. So we wanted to touch on Palantir, revisit the company, and in the process of doing so, we uncovered just how deeply political this company is. And maybe we hadn't realized that before. We certainly noted that in our original points of contention. So we said here the CEO engages heavily in politics. That was mainly after reading the letters that he wrote shareholders. We noted this over-reliance on the U.S. government, which makes up 44% of their total revenues right now. We said we wanted to see most of their revenues coming from the commercial side. So we have a belief that when the U.S. government sits at the negotiating table, you don't have much power. They get to dictate the terms of everything. So it becomes quite risky to have them as your largest customer. Certainly, a majority of revenues isn't desirable. There's also the flip side of that. The U.S. government can be a very lucrative customer to have. We're risk-averse tech investors, so we frown upon having too many dependencies on the government, especially when the administration changes every 4 years. So we also noted this SPAC revenue round-tripping. So Palantir had invested in probably somewhere around 20 different SPACs. That turned out to be not so good of a decision, at least thus far. But when you look at the contributions of these related party revenues, they're really minimal. So there's no point in talking about that much except to say that it showed some rather poor decision-making. Now, when we look at Palantir's most recent deck, we see around 44% of total revenues are coming from the commercial side, and here you can see that commercial revenue growth is growing much faster than government. So all things being equal, we would expect commercial to eventually hit a majority. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Another notable event in their earnings call was the company had their first ever profitable quarter, and you can see that here. They have around $2.6 billion in cash, so achieving profitability in our mind really isn't a priority given they have that much cash, but it's great to see. And this just goes to show how important it is to have strong gross margins. Palantir's are upwards of 80%. Now, the not so good news is that their revenue growth is slowing. So they're guiding, the midpoint of their guidance for 2023 represents about 15% revenue growth. And coming out of 2022, they had net retention. That's how much they're able to upsell existing customers. Net retention rate was around 115%, which frankly is a bit mediocre. So there's nothing to complain about 15% revenue growth, especially for a company that's growing. The larger you get, the more you scale, the more difficult it becomes to grow revenues. But the bull thesis seems to be acceptable. Their revenue growth of 15%, given the macroeconomic headwinds, is nothing to sneeze at. Their average spend for clients, somewhere around $40 million, means their solution is firmly entrenched. And the lack of non-U.S. growth that we're going to talk about in a second is acceptable, and so is, for some, this heavy reliance on U.S. Department of Defense spending. Some people see that as a positive. Again, their gross margins are excellent, they're profitable, and this viewpoint they have of being U.S.-centric can certainly just be adopted. But there are some concerns from abroad. So this recent article by Wired talks about how Germany is raising red flags about Palantir's big data dragnet. And this comment in the earnings call from CEO Alex Karp is quite interesting. He says, the weakness in our business is just non-U.S. commercial. That grew around 12% last year. I think outside the U.S., they're a lot less friendly to new innovations. No, that's not necessarily true. we've been traveling around the globe scouting tech startups now for half a decade, and innovation is everywhere. It's just that Mr. Karp tends to take a viewpoint of the world that may be turning some people off. We're going to talk more about that. In Palantir's own words, analytic technology, especially in the hands of powerful institutions that hold large volumes of data, can pose serious risks to privacy and civil liberties. That's the point of contention the Germans have. So before we get into this next section, I wanted to throw up this short disclaimer. We're a politics-free zone. Everyone leaves their political beliefs at the door. All viewpoints are welcome. Now, if you agree with everything your political party says, you're probably going to want to sign off now, because you need to proceed to this next section with a little bit of an open mind. Now, I've pulled out here some of Karp's comments, that's the CEO's comments, in the latest earnings call, and it's just it's overwhelming how much this gentleman focuses on the war in Eastern Europe and the domination of the West. I mean, you can read all these things, how many times he talks about the importance of Western institutions, and that Palantir is in this to make institutions of the West stronger, to continue to supply to our allies across the world, bringing the fight to our adversaries, a crucial contribution to the West. Western institutions, this whole earnings call is riddled with his political comments, and every time other company executives, when they talk, they try to talk about operational metrics or financial metrics. Whenever it goes back to Mr. Karp, he just starts ranting about these various things. So one of the problems that we have with that is you can expect very little transparency from the company because they're becoming so entrenched with the U.S. Department of Defense. And this question here in the earnings call is a great example. So this analyst asked, he inquires about a handful of transactions that got pushed and ultimately not exactly sure what happened there relating to their government business. Mr. Karp's response: the only update is this call is coming from Washington. And he talks about how Washington and regular people in Congress and the military see what's going on, and now there's just increasing levels of interest. And he says, what does that mean year to year? I don't know. So even he is uncertain about what the future brings in terms of what the government is willing to spend, when they're willing to spend it. But he says here, the future will represent the past. In other words, they expect to have this continued reliance on the U.S. Department of Defense, and their establishment last month of the Palantir Foundation for Defense Policy and International Affairs in Washington certainly implies that they're just digging themselves in deeper. Now, we can certainly agree with Mr. Karp on the problems with the Chinese Communist Party. So communism kills. There's plenty of examples of that. There's a great book, my favorite book, I talk about it quite often, Wild Swans, Three Daughters of China, that you ought to read and learn about how evil communism is. And there's other books you can read. Gulag Archipelago talks about Russian communism, and there's all sorts of examples out there that teach about the problems that you have in communist societies, mainly being when it comes to capitalists engaging with communists, this notion of corruption. So the question we've asked here, does any society with corruption need fixing? Probably, because corruption isn't good. It makes it very difficult to advance the interests of people or to provide a capitalist society with mobility. So we don't want history to repeat itself. For Western companies, doing business in China is inefficient. So I'm actually a citizen of Hong Kong, which is not China, but they're starting to merge these days. But we tried to sell risk management products to the Chinese for a very long time, and the Chinese love risk. So when you talk about managing risk, that just doesn't ring a bell with them. So we can understand the comment in their 10Q about how they don't want to do business with China. That's fair enough. But what about Russia? Well, again, we have a corruption communism problem. And of course, Russia's on everyone's radar because of the recent war. I was in Russia not too long before the war, and you'd be surprised how much they love Americans. And certainly I can tell you a lot of Russians there disagree with what's going on, but they're not allowed to say something. And when you're not allowed to speak up, that's a big problem. So global leaders who make comments about the war that's happening in Ukraine, they should be pushing for the war to end, for lives to stop being lost, not encouraging it. So it's the only thing that I'll say about that. The other problem here is that when you isolate dictators, that never works out well for the people. You can look at the DPRK as a great example of that. But only with sufficient research and an open mind will you be able to understand both sides in any conflict, and you always should. So when you look at the Ukraine war, Ukraine became a battleground in 2014, quite a while ago, when Russia annexed Crimea and began arming separatists. And most people who wave Ukraine flags on Twitter couldn't point out the place on a map. So if you're going to have an opinion about this conflict, make sure it's informed, and you can start with this piece Vladimir Putin published in July of 2021, talking about the reasons why the conflict starts. He very clearly spells out in this piece exactly why the war is taking place. So once you've read that and fully understood that, then you can fly your Ukrainian flag in your Twitter profile, and we can all agree that war is bad and that Russia should not be attacking Ukraine. So we know now that Mr. Karp's comments are acceptable when it comes to China and Russia, but what about the other 192 countries in the world? So, just looking at his comments, China and Russia bad, Japan, United Kingdom, America good. But what about the French, or what about the Saudis? When you look at military expenditures, Mr. Karp wants to talk about how important their platform is for defense and pursuing the interests of Western civilization. And if we're going to look at defense spending, then we need to consider the biggest spenders. Of course, China and Russia, they're in positions 2 and 4. They're not being considered as a target market for Mr. Karp. But what about India? Or what about the Saudis? Now, doing business with the Saudis, this is quite interesting. I spent some time over in Saudi several years back, and the culture is changing extremely quickly. There are no more religious police. You actually have women drivers now, some even driving for Uber, which is somewhat of a scary experience. They haven't been driving for very long. And what's interesting is when you talk to Saudi women about their freedoms and whether or not they want their faces to be masked, as is popular in certain Middle Eastern countries, you'd be surprised at their responses. Some say, well, I want to have that option. So when I go out and I'm seeing somebody or I'm dating somebody, I may not want the gossip machine to be running. Or if I go out in the morning to get something from the grocery store and I don't want to put on makeup, I like having that option. So it's quite interesting to talk to the women of Saudi Arabia and see how they feel about how, let's say, the West thinks that they ought to be behaving. Saudis happen to have some of the most dangerous roads in the world because 38% of the people there are immigrants, and they all drive like maniacs because that's how they drive in the countries that they come from. But what was most interesting to me in Saudi Arabia was just how different the country is from the perceptions that they present to the West. So alcohol and drugs can be punishable in Saudi Arabia by flogging, imprisonment, or death. But I can tell you that I've never seen so much cocaine in my life. So one of the benefits of doing an MBA is the network that you get. And I went over to Saudi and happened to be fairly connected with some individuals that would be considered royalty, and the amount of partying that these people do and the money that they spend on that partying would blow your mind. A bottle of Jack Daniels costs about $800 because they need to smuggle that in, and there are plenty of foreigners willing to take the hit there on the smuggling operations that fuel the sort of opulent parties that the Saudis like to throw. Homosexuality, though, is one thing that certainly doesn't fly anywhere, and one wonders how these facts about Saudi Arabia, how they present themselves to the world, how do these mesh with Western values? Well, it's just some of the questions that we would ask when looking at how Mr. Karp wants to impose his global viewpoints on investors. And I'll just leave it at this. So I was in North Korea on the DMZ zone on the north side, and this gentleman here was giving us a tour, and he sat there for 20 minutes talking about how North Korea would smash the Americans and kill the Americans and wipe them off the face of this planet, and this very aggressive speech. And when he got done with that, we were walking along the border there, and he looked at me and he had an interpreter, said, "Where are you from?" I said, "I'm from the United States." He said, "Oh, what do you think of what I just said?" And I said, "Well, I understand that you don't like the country, but you like the people." And he said, No, that's not true. He said, "I like the people, I like the government, and I like your country. I don't like your policies towards my country." And coming from a 26-year-old kid who would be fighting on the front lines were there ever a war, I thought that was a very profound thing to say. So just to conclude here, companies need to stay out of politics because they need to be focused on running companies, not doing geopolitical analysis. Where do shareholders sit in this hierarchy of priorities Mr. Karp has? He's doing his company no favors by going on these rants and these earnings calls. Growth of 15%, sure, that's acceptable. It's not remarkable. We're going to check back in with Palantir a year from now, see how things are going. Last point to make here, we invest in companies, not stocks. So when that volatile share price starts jumping all over the place, that doesn't validate or invalidate any of the conclusions that we've talked about today. So I've put up another piece here, another video you might find of interest. Before you watch that, please click on the Nanalyze logo here, subscribe to our channel. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch this today.